Welcome back! Today we're diving straight into a really wild Supreme Court case, Niña Lumauan versus the Metropolitan Tuguegarao Water District. It's a classic legal battle over money, timing, and who ultimately gets left holding the bag.
So put yourself in this exact position. Your boss gives you a nice, chunky bonus. You spend it, right? Maybe on a vacation, paying off bills, whatever. You completely move on with your life. Then, literally years later, the government knocks on your door and says, yeah, about that payout, it was illegal and we need every penny back. Honestly, what would you even do? It's absolute nightmare fuel. But this is exactly the anxiety that kicked off the intense legal showdown we're unpacking today.
And just to put things into perspective, let's look at the actual stakes here. Nearly 1.7 million pesos. This was the massive aggregate total of an accrued cost of living allowance, which we'll just call COLA for short, that was paid out to the water district employees. Seems great at first, until the Commission on Audit, or COA, abruptly steps in and completely disallows the whole thing.
Now, you really have to see this timeline because the delay is just staggering. Between 1992 and 1997, this allowance was supposedly racking up. But get this. The board didn't actually approve the payout until 2009. That is well over a decade later. Fast forward 1 year to 2010, the COA drops the hammer with a notice of disallowance. And finally, in 2011, Lumauan, who was the acting general manager at the time, files her appeal. It's this enormous gap between the accrual and the actual payday that put a giant target on their backs for an audit.
Okay, so to make sense of this whole legal maze, we're going to break this explainer into 5 quick parts. We'll start with the disallowed bonus, see how our petitioner was saved by the clock, unpack the salary integration rule, look at the rules of return, and finish up with the final verdict.
Part 1. The disallowed bonus. Let's look at this retroactive payout under scrutiny. Moving right along to Part 2, saved by the clock. Was the appeal actually filed too late? You know, it's crazy how a single, tiny piece of paper can totally make or break a case. The COA regional director claimed Lumauan filed her appeal 12 days late. And in the legal world, if that's true, game over. The case is closed and you lose. But the Supreme Court took a hard look at the evidence. Lumauan had her mail registry receipt proving, without a doubt, she filed on November 25, 2011, the exact same day she received the decision. Boom, she wins the procedural battle right there and keeps her fight alive. So, into Part 3, the salary integration rule. We need to figure out, was this allowance actually illegal in the first place? All right, let's look at Section 12 of Republic Act 6758. That's the Compensation and Position Classification Act. Basically, this rule standardizes government salaries by rolling a bunch of different allowances into one single basic pay rate. Think of it kind of like a bundled streaming service. You don't pay a separate bill for the movies, another for sports, and another for kids' shows, right? It's all just baked into one monthly subscription. Standardizing salaries works exactly the same way. The law just assumes those standard allowances are already baked right into your basic paycheck. Now, there are a few exceptions. The law does allow for a strict list of exclusive, non-integrated allowances, stuff like representation and transportation, clothing, hazard pay, you get the idea. But take a really close look. Notice what is entirely missing from that list? Yeah, the cost of living allowance. Because it isn't on this exclusive list, by legal fiction, the COLA was already considered part of their base pay. So paying it out as a separate extra bonus meant they were essentially getting paid twice for the cost of living, which means, yep, the payout really was illegal. Let's jump into Part 4, the rules of return, and look at the real-world consequences of an honest mistake. So how do we decide who owes what? We use the Supreme Court's Madera rules. It all boils down to your specific role in the mess. If you're an approving officer and you acted in bad faith, you are solidarily liable, meaning you're on the hook for the whole net amount. But if you're an approving officer acting in good faith, you're entirely off the hook. Now, if you are just a passive recipient, meaning you didn't approve the payout, you just happily received the funds in your bank account, you have to return exactly what you got. Since Lumauan didn't actually approve this payout herself, the board of directors did, the court classified her strictly as a passive recipient. You might be wondering, why does a passive recipient have to pay it back if they didn't do anything wrong? It comes down to a fundamental civil law concept called saluto indebiti. It's a Latin phrase, but basically it's a rule against unjust enrichment. It forces the return of undue payments, totally regardless of whether you took the money in good faith. Put simply, Good faith doesn't save you if you got money you were never legally supposed to have, unless you can prove it was for actual services rendered. And unfortunately for them, that just wasn't the case here.
Which brings us to our fifth and final part, the final verdict. Good faith versus fiscal leakage.
The court's logic is perfectly summed up right here. They stated that solutio indebiti is an equitable principle which prevents undue fiscal leakage that may take place if the government is unable to recover from passive recipients amounts corresponding to a properly disallowed transaction. The Supreme Court drew a very firm line in the sand. Protecting government funds from leaking out is simply a higher priority than an employee's innocent, well-meaning receipt of that cash.
So, what's the final verdict for our petitioner? Niña Lumauan is ordered to return the disallowed amount, but only what she actually and individually received. That's a huge sigh of relief for her, because she doesn't have to scrape together the entire 1.7 million peso aggregate that the audit originally flagged. She's only on the hook for her own personal cut of the bonus. Which leaves us with a really tough question to wrap up this explainer. Should strict legal liability always override an employee's good faith when we're talking about returning corporate or government funds? It is an incredibly delicate balance, right? You have fairness to someone who just made an honest mistake on one hand, and the absolute necessity of protecting public money on the other. Think about your own workplace. If this happened to you, where do you think that line should be drawn? Thanks so much for diving into this one with us, and keep learning.